Welcome back. So be sure you have your lecture quizzes open, and I'm going to talk very fast because I have a lot to say in 15 minutes. So just as a reminder, we're going to be talking about social construction again, like we have almost every class this semester. So I'm sure that you know what it is now, but social construction is a perspective that suggests that something is only real, meaningful, or valuable when society deems it so, and it becomes that way through social interaction. We do this with language, symbols, food, gestures, and even the way that we categorize people. Last week we talked about the ways that we categorize people according to gender, and this week we will talk about how we categorize people according to race. As you can see, this is a picture of our former President Obama, and as many of you may know, Obama's he's mixed race. His mother was a white woman who lived in Hawaii, and his father was a dark-skinned African man who lived in Africa. But how we call him, the way he looks is a biological fact, but what we call him, how we classify him as an African American man, is a social construction, especially considering his the racial makeup of his parentage. So what is race? Is race a biological concept? Is race based on biology? So are these physical terms? The text refers to racial classifications which distinguish people by the color of their skin or other physical characteristics, but also points out problems with classifying people in this way. If race is not a biological category, then what is it? It must be a social construction. So a sociological definition of race goes like this: a group of people who are perceived by a given society to be biologically different from others. So, hold on, I'm missing a page. Okay, in order to understand the way that we classify people according to race in modern times, it's important to look at historical notions of race and how race has been categorized in the past. So in ancient times, there were distinctions among people based on how they looked, but the focus was on geography, so there were physical markers linked to geography. In Greece, Rome, and the early Christian era, the notion of a biological set of traits carried in the bloodlines was unheard of. Physical markers were thought to be due to environmental factors. So, for instance, if you lived at the equator, let's say you lived in the north, in Norway, for instance, it was thought that if you had light skin and moved and lived in Norway, that if you moved to the equator, then your skin would become much darker, and you would tan, but your race wouldn't change. Modern racial thinking began in the early 17th century and paralleled broad global changes such as the age of exploration and the emergence of science. So Omi and Wynant, who I'm going to be talking about a lot in today, and who you'll be reading about in your textbook, are two sociologists who came up with an idea called racial formations, and racial formations describes how race has come to be defined and our continued process of defining people according to race. They claimed that race was a scientific issue, a religious issue, and a political issue. So it was a religious issue, was related to the European explorers. So when European explorers first came into contact with people who looked differently than they did, their notions on the origins of the species was challenged. So we're talking about people who set out from Europe and traveled the globe by ship and came into contact with people in lands that they had discovered for Europe and that Europeans hadn't seen before. And the people on them looked very different than these Europeans looked. They dressed differently. They had different, all different kinds of physical characteristics and also different cultural practices. So when they landed in these places, their notions about where we all came from was challenged. They had believed that all people were children of God. But if these people looked so different, how could that be explained? They wondered if people were made in God's image and the people that they knew all had light, fair-complected skin, light hair, light eyes, and they believed they were created in God's image, then they wondered, are these people created in God's image? These were religious people. They wondered, were they people that could be converted? Could their souls be saved? What human rights should be extended to them? If it was thought that Europeans were the children of God, but no one else was, then these others did not have the same rights. And so these explorers used this way of thinking to justify appropriating their lands and their properties, enslaving them, and even extermination. So they believed that these others weren't the same as them. It was sort of the ultimate ethnocentrism. And so Omi and Wynant claimed that this was one of the first times that that racial categorization came into being. They also claimed that race is a scientific issue. So this era of exploration that we were talking about was also coincided with the great era of scientific discovery up through the 16th through the 18th and 19th century. Classification systems abounded during these times, and many of these schemes involved classifying humans in one way or another. If you've ever been to a natural history museum, you might see animals and insects categorized into minuscule little categories. So you might, if you go into a natural history museum, you might see a butterfly room where there's every different type of butterfly. And this all came about, these classifications came about during this great era of scientific discovery. And so, of course, it came to be applied to humans as well. And so they started classifying humans according to whether or not they were criminals, whether they had mental illness, and then also race. So race was thought of as solely a biological concept, but it was difficult to come up with a precise definition for it. So I'm going to talk about the people that you see on the screen are different scientists and social theorists who came up with different classification schemes for people according to their race. So the first one was Bernier in 1684. He was one of the first people to come up with a classification scheme for people according to their race, and he had 4 races. He called them Europe, Africa proper, Asia proper, and Lapland. And if you don't know it, Lapland is a region that's north of Sweden. He called the people from Lapland ugly, squat, small, and animal-like. which is funny because they're beautiful, blonde, Swedish people, and are not ugly, squat, small, or animal-like. So he came up with 4 classification schemes. Blumenbach, in 1775, wrote a treatise on the natural varieties of mankind. He cataloged race according to phrenology. This is a phrenological chart, and if you look closely, you can see that on some of the skulls there are drawn like little circles with numbers in them. Phrenology was a pseudoscience, which means it was a not real science, and but they used it as a science at the time, and they felt that they could find out things about humans by looking at the shape of their skull and the bumps on their heads, and that's what you're seeing there. So Blumenbach cataloged race using phrenology according to 5 different categories. Johann Caspar comes next. He was around the same period as Blumenbach, and what he did was he looked at physiognomy, which correlates outside appearances with inner virtues. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit when we talk about Sir Francis Galton. I'm sure you've all heard of Charles Darwin and the survival of the fittest. This was reworked by a sociologist named Herbert Spencer and called social Darwinism. Let me see. This is a 19th century theory. And what he believed was that some people defined by their race are better fit for survival than others. And so those who are better fit, their race would remain and the other races would fall away. Now this is quite a long time ago, and no races have really fallen away. So what can we say about his? Let me see. You know, it's looking like I am going to need a third recording after all, so I will be doing a third one, but hopefully it will be shorter. So your second quiz question I answered. It says, which of the following delineated categories of race based on the principles of phrenology? And the answer was Blumenbach. Go back to this slide. So let's see, where are we? So, we've already covered all those guys. So now we'll talk about monogenists and polygenists, and this is the subject of your third quiz question. Monogenists believe that humans are united as a species. Polygenists at the time believed that different races were different species. This was not a long-lived debate, and obviously monogenists won the debate. We know that humans are united as a species, but the debate lingers, unfortunately, and is one factor leading to prejudice and discrimination. So your third question, the answer is that monogenists believe that humans are united as a species, and polygenists believe that different races are different species. I'm actually going to stop right there, and then we'll pick it up on the third slide. The third recording.